Picture this. You're a Spanish conquistador in the year 1540. You've marched north from Mexico through desert that can kill a man in half a day. Your armor weighs 60 pounds, and the sun has turned it into a torture device. You're looking for gold, for glory, for cities that glitter like the stories say they do. And then you see them. They appear like ghosts from rocks you'd swear were empty seconds before. They move through terrain that would break your horse's legs without making a sound. When you blink, they're gone. When you turn around, they're behind you. These are the Apache, and you've just stumbled into their world. Now here's what gets me about this moment. The Spanish had conquered the Aztec Empire. They'd toppled civilizations that built pyramids and commanded millions of subjects. They thought they understood warfare in the New World. But the Apache was something entirely different. The Apache weren't building cities or temples. They were the mountains. They were the desert. They were every shadow that moved wrong, every sound that didn't belong, every path that led nowhere. For 3 centuries, these people would teach the most powerful empires on Earth what it meant to fight on Apache terms. But let me back up, because to understand how the Apache became the most feared warriors in North America, you have to understand something that most people miss. This wasn't just about warfare. This was about a way of life so perfectly adapted to one of the harshest environments on the continent that it turned survival itself into a weapon. The Apache homeland stretched across what we now call Arizona, New Mexico, western Texas, northern Mexico, southern Colorado, and southern Utah, 6 modern states. But thinking of it as states misses the point entirely. This was a landscape where water determined everything, where knowing the location of every spring, every seasonal stream, every hidden tank of rainwater caught in rock formations could mean the difference between life and death for your entire family. The Apache didn't just live in this desert. They mastered it. And the foundation of that mastery? The women. Now, when most people think about Apache warfare, they picture warriors on horseback, raiding and fighting. That's part of the story. But here's what they miss. Apache women knew over 300 different plants that could keep you alive in country where a wrong turn meant dying of thirst. 300 plants. They knew which cactus fruits ripened when, which roots stored water, which seeds could be ground into meal that would last for months. Think about that for a second. Your grandmother might know 20 plants in her garden. These women carried in their heads the botanical knowledge that let entire families disappear into landscapes where armies couldn't follow. The century plant, what the Apache called the mescal, became the cornerstone of their economy. When these massive agave plants bloomed, Apache families would converge on the harvest sites. They'd roast the hearts in pit ovens for days, creating food that was nutritious, portable, and would last for months. But here's the thing that really gets me. The location of the best century plant groves was knowledge passed down from grandmother to granddaughter for generations. Secret knowledge, strategic knowledge, because controlling the food sources meant controlling the territory. While the women built this invisible foundation of survival, Apache men were developing tactics that would baffle military minds for centuries. They perfected the lightning raid, strike fast, take what you need, vanish before anyone could organize a response. They could travel 60 miles in a day through country where soldiers struggled to make 10. They could live off the land indefinitely, while their enemies needed supply trains that moved like giant targets through the desert. But the Apache faced a problem that would define the next 3 centuries. Other people wanted their children. Mexican silver mines needed workers. And Apache children, raised in a culture that prized endurance and adaptability, made ideal slaves for the brutal conditions underground. Spanish slavers would raid Apache camps, stealing children to sell in Mexican markets. The bounty on an Apache child's head made hunting them profitable. Now think about this from an Apache parent's perspective. Your way of life depends on your children learning hundreds of survival skills. Which plants to eat, which water sources are reliable, how to read weather patterns, how to move through country without leaving tracks. This knowledge takes years to pass down. and strangers keep trying to steal your children to work them to death in silver mines. What would you do? The Apache response created the first generation of great war leaders, men like Mangus Coloradas, and when I say giant, I mean this man stood 6 feet 6 inches tall at a time when the average height was 5 feet 4. He began uniting Apache bands not just for raids, but for coordinated resistance against the slave trade. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Apache bands had always been independent. They'd cooperate when it made sense, but they'd never had centralized leadership. The crisis of the slave trade forced them to develop new forms of organization, new strategies, new leaders, and it worked. By 1700, Apache territory was effectively closed to uninvited visitors. They controlled the mountain passes. They knew every water source across thousands of square miles. They could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear into country that would kill anyone who tried to follow. Spanish colonial reports from this period are fascinating. Commander after commander describes the same phenomenon. Apache bands that seem to materialize from nowhere, strike with devastating efficiency, and vanish so completely that soldiers begin to wonder if they were real at all. One Spanish officer wrote to his superiors, "They are like wolves who have learned to use weapons. They take what they need and disappear. We cannot catch them. We cannot predict them. They know our movements before we make them." Now here's what I find remarkable about this period. The Apache were facing the full weight of the Spanish Empire, the same empire that had conquered most of Central and South America. But they weren't just surviving. They were expanding their effective territory. They were becoming more organized, more sophisticated, more dangerous, because they had something the Spanish didn't understand. They had a culture built around adaptation. While Spanish soldiers needed supply lines, Apache families needed knowledge. While Spanish armies needed reinforcements, Apache bands needed information. While Spanish commanders needed orders from distant capitals, Apache war leaders needed consensus from people who lived or died by their decisions. The Spanish tried everything. They built presidios, frontier forts designed to control Apache movement. But the Apache just went around them. They tried negotiated treaties, but Apache bands operated independently. A treaty with one group didn't bind another. They tried systematic campaigns of extermination, but the Apache knew every hiding place in country that stretched further than most European kingdoms. By the end of the 1700s, Spanish colonial authorities were writing reports that sound almost desperate. They described Apache raids that struck targets hundreds of miles apart on the same night. They reported Apache leaders who seemed to know Spanish troop movements before Spanish officers did. They documented attacks so swift and precise that by the time soldiers arrived at the scene, they'd find empty camps and cold fires. But here's the thing that really gets me about this period. All of this, the military tactics, the territorial control, the sophisticated intelligence networks, all of this was built on top of a culture where women's knowledge of desert survival made the whole system possible. Apache families could disappear into landscapes where armies died of thirst because Apache women knew which rocks caught rainwater, which plants stored moisture, which animals led you to hidden springs. Apache war, parties could travel for weeks without resupply because Apache women had created a network of cached food and equipment across thousands of square miles. The Spanish never understood this. They saw Apache warriors and missed the invisible foundation that made Apache warfare possible. They were fighting not just against armed men, but against entire families whose survival skills had been honed by generations of living in one of the harshest environments in North America. By 1800, the situation had reached a kind of equilibrium. Spanish settlements clung to river valleys and well-watered areas. Apache bands controlled the mountains, the desert, and everything in between. Raids and counter-raids had become a way of life. Children on both sides grew up expecting violence, preparing for violence, shaped by violence. But equilibrium in a situation like this is unstable, because south of the border, Mexico was about to win its independence. And the new Mexican government was going to try something the Spanish had never attempted. They were going to put a price on Apache lives. 100 pesos for a warrior's scalp, 50 pesos for a woman's, 25 pesos for a child's. The hunting season was about to begin. And when it did, it would transform the Apache Wars from a territorial conflict into something much darker. Something that would test the limits of human endurance and create legends that we're still trying to understand today. Because you're about to meet Apache leaders whose names became synonymous with resistance itself. You're about to see warfare so brutal and tactics so sophisticated that they would challenge everything military leaders thought they knew about combat. And you're about to discover how Apache women's testimonies from military prisons would reveal one of the most heartbreaking truths in American history. When captivity becomes refuge, the hunt itself has exceeded the limits of what human beings can endure. But that's where we're heading. For now, picture those Spanish conquistadors again, stumbling into Apache country in 1540. They thought they were discovering a new territory to conquer. What they'd actually found was a people who had turned survival in impossible country into an art form. And for the next 3.5 centuries, that art form was going to teach the world's most powerful armies what it really meant to fight for your homeland. 1821. Mexico wins its independence from Spain, and suddenly everything changes. Not gradually, overnight. Because the new Mexican government looks north at Apache territory and sees something the Spanish never quite managed to see clearly. They see a problem that can be solved with money, 100 pesos for an Apache warrior's scalp, 50 for a woman's, 25 for a child's. Now let me put this in perspective for you. A Mexican laborer in 1821 might earn 20 pesos in a good month. 20 pesos. So we're talking about bounties that could make a man rich, if he could collect them. And here's the thing that should make your blood run cold. These weren't bounties on criminals. These were bounties on people for being Apache. The Mexican government had just legalized genocide and made it profitable. But here's what the politicians in Mexico City didn't understand about the people they just declared war on. The Apache had been preparing for this moment for generations without knowing it. Every survival skill, every tactical innovation, every piece of cultural knowledge that had let them master the desert was about to be tested in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. And the Apache response would create legends, mangas. Colorado's was already a giant among his people, 6 feet 6 inches of muscle and determination, in a world where most men stood 5 feet 4. But the scalp bounties transformed him from a regional war leader into something the Apache had never had before, a unifying force that could bring together bands who had fought independently for centuries. Now think about what this meant. Apache society was built around small, flexible family groups that could disappear into country where armies starved. But the scalp bounties changed the math. Individual bands couldn't fight off the kind of coordinated campaigns that 100-peso bounties would fund. They needed something new. They needed organization on a scale that went against everything Apache culture had ever been. Mangas, coloradas made it work. And the key was something that Spanish commanders had never understood. Apache women's intelligence networks. While Mexican officials were planning their campaigns in comfortable offices hundreds of miles south, Apache women were building a communication system that spanned territories larger than most European countries. They used mirror signals that could flash messages across mountain ranges. They used smoke that looked like natural fires to anyone who didn't know the code. They used patterns in how they arranged stones that told other Apache families which routes were safe, which water sources were being watched, which areas to avoid. But the most sophisticated part of their intelligence network was nearly invisible. Apache women traded with Pueblo communities, Mexican settlements, even American trading posts when they appeared. They listened. They remembered. They shared information. A comment about troop movements overheard at a trading post could reach Apache war leaders hundreds of miles away within days, Mexican military commanders started reporting. Something that sounds almost supernatural. Apache war parties that seemed to know exactly where Mexican soldiers were going before the soldiers themselves knew. Raids that struck targets just hours after the defending troops had been pulled away for other duties. Ambushes that caught Mexican forces in places where no Apache should have been able to predict their movements. What they were seeing was the result of intelligence gathering that made their own military networks look primitive. And then there was Mangus Colorados's daughter. History doesn't record her Apache name. The sources call her by different names, but what matters is what she became. She was 17 years old when she watched Mexican scalp hunters club her mother to death for 25 pesos. 25 pesos. Less than what a good horse cost. That 17-year-old girl became something Apache culture had rarely seen. A woman warrior. Not just someone who could fight when cornered, but someone who sought out battles. Someone who led raids. Someone whose name made Mexican settlers bar their doors at night. She learned to use weapons with a precision that terrified Mexican soldiers. But more importantly, she learned to use the intelligence networks her mother had helped build. She could coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles. She could make Mexican commanders think they were chasing one small band when they were actually walking into traps set by a dozen different groups working together. The Mexican response created a cycle of violence that still makes me sick to think about, because the scalp bounty system had a problem that should have been obvious from the start. Mexican scalp hunters couldn't tell the difference between Apache hair and Mexican hair. Dark hair was dark hair. 25 pesos was 25 pesos. Mexican settlements started finding their own dead neighbors scalped and turned in for bounty money. The system designed to protect Mexican civilians was killing them. But instead of abandoning the bounty system, Mexican authorities doubled down. They armed civilian settlements and told them to defend themselves. Now you had Mexican farmers and ranchers who were trying to work land that Apache families had been using for centuries. You had Apache warriors who were watching their hunting grounds turn into cattle ranches, and their sacred sites get plowed under for cornfields. And you had scalp hunters, some Mexican, some American mercenaries, who were making money off the violence no matter who died. The borderlands became a killing ground where three different cultures were trapped in a triangle of revenge that fed on itself. Apache raids became more sophisticated, more devastating. They perfected tactics that left entire haciendas empty, buildings intact, but every living thing dead or disappeared. They learned to strike multiple targets simultaneously across territories so vast that Mexican authorities couldn't coordinate responses. But here's what gets me about this period. The Apache weren't just reacting to Mexican aggression. They were innovating. They were adapting. They were taking everything they knew about desert warfare and scaling it up to meet threats that would have destroyed less resilient cultures. Mexican military reports from this period describe Apache war parties that could travel 100 miles in 24 hours through country where Mexican cavalry struggled to make half that distance. They describe attacks so coordinated that they seem to require supernatural communication. They describe Apache leaders who appeared to have turned warfare into a science, and at the center of it all were the women, not just as intelligence gatherers, but as the economic foundation that made extended campaigns possible. Apache women could prepare food that would last for months without spoiling. They could make clothing that would protect warriors in desert heat and mountain cold. They could treat wounds with plant medicines that worked as well as anything Mexican army doctors had. Most importantly, they could keep families alive while the men were away fighting. Because Apache warfare wasn't just about warriors going off to battle. It was about entire communities that had to stay mobile, stay hidden, stay supplied, while being hunted by people who were paid to kill them. By 1830, Mexican settlers were abandoning huge swaths of territory. Towns that had existed for generations were turning into ghost settlements. Ranches that had been profitable for decades were being sold for whatever their owners could get before fleeing south. The Apache were winning. Not just battles, they were winning the war for control of their homeland, but winning came at a price that was tearing Apache society apart. Constant warfare meant that children grew up without fathers. It meant that traditional activities, the ceremonies, the seasonal gatherings, the careful passing down of cultural knowledge had to be compressed into whatever time could be stolen between attacks and retreats, and the violence was changing people in ways that scared their own families. Warriors who had once raided for horses and supplies were now killing for revenge. Women who had once focused on keeping families alive were now planning attacks. Children who should have been learning songs and stories were learning how to hide from scalp hunters. The Apache were becoming what their enemies had always claimed they were, a people defined by warfare. But they were doing it to survive in a world that had put prices on their heads and called it justice. Mexican independence had promised to bring order to the northern frontier. Instead, it had created something much worse than anything the Spanish had managed. It had created a war where the rules of civilized combat didn't apply, where civilian and warrior were indistinguishable, where profit motive drove policy and revenge drove everything else. And just when it seemed like this cycle of violence might burn itself out, just when Apache resistance had made the scalp bounty system too expensive to maintain, another empire arrived on the scene, 1846. The Mexican-American War ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Apache homeland becomes American territory overnight. New flag, new government, new policies. But here's the thing that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. No one bothered to tell the Apache that they were now supposedly American citizens living on American soil. No one asked them what they thought about the change in management. The Apache woke up one morning to find out that their 3-century war for independence had just been handed over to a different set of invaders. Invaders who had bigger armies, better weapons, and their own ideas about what should happen to inconvenient populations. The Americans looked at Apache territory and saw something the Spanish and Mexicans had missed. They didn't just see land to be controlled, they saw land to be crossed. They saw railroad routes and telegraph lines and wagon roads that needed to connect California to the rest of the expanding United States. The Apache controlled the mountain passes that those routes would have to use. They controlled the water sources that would determine whether American expansion succeeded or failed. They controlled territory that was about to become strategically vital to American dreams of a continental empire. And the Americans were about to discover what the Spanish and Mexicans had learned the hard way. The Apache didn't just live in that territory. They were that territory. Every canyon, every water source, every game trail was part of a cultural knowledge that had been refined over centuries of survival in impossible country. But American military doctrine was different from anything the Apache had faced before. American armies didn't just want to defeat Apache warriors. They wanted to eliminate Apache resistance by eliminating Apache culture itself. They wanted to break the connection between Apache people and Apache land so completely that the survivors would have no choice but to surrender. They were about to try something that neither Spanish conquistadors nor Mexican scalp hunters had attempted. They were going to make war, not just on Apache warriors, but on everything that made Apache life possible. The hunting season was about to get much, much worse, and it was going to create leaders whose names would become synonymous with resistance itself. Men like Cochise, who would turn American military confidence into American military nightmare, but it was also going to push Apache culture to breaking points that would test whether any people could survive the systematic destruction of everything that gave. Their lives, meaning the empires, had collided. The Apache had survived Spanish colonialism and Mexican genocide. Now they were about to face American efficiency, and American efficiency was going to teach everyone involved lessons about warfare that no one wanted to learn. February 5th, 1861. Apache Pass, Arizona Territory. A place that's about to become synonymous with blood, betrayal, and the kind of tragic misunderstanding that changes the course of history. Lieutenant George Bascom, fresh out of West Point, 26 years old, full of military academy confidence, is about to make a decision that will cost thousands of lives and turn one of the most peaceful Apache leaders into the most feared warrior in the Southwest. But let me back up, because to understand what happened at Apache Pass, you need to understand what the Americans thought they were dealing with when they inherited Apache country from Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 had made Apache homeland American territory overnight. One day the Apache were fighting Mexicans. The next day they were supposedly American citizens living on American soil. Except nobody told them. Nobody asked them. Nobody seemed to think their opinion mattered. The first American officials who arrived in Apache territory found something that confused them completely. Here were people who had been at war with Mexico for decades, people who had effective control over territories larger than most eastern states, people who had military organizations sophisticated enough to coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles. But they didn't have the things Americans expected to see when they met another nation. No cities. No written treaties, no centralized government that could speak for all Apache bands, no representatives who could sign documents that would bind every Apache warrior to keep the peace. The Americans made the same mistake the Spanish and Mexicans had made, but they made it bigger. They assumed that because Apache society didn't look like their society, it must be simpler than their society. They thought they could manage the Apache problem with the same tools they'd used to manage other Indian tribes back east. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Now, among the Apache leaders the Americans encountered was a man named Cochise. He led the Chiricahua band that controlled the Dragoon Mountains and the approaches to Apache Pass, the most important route through the region. And here's what made Cochise unusual among Apache war leaders. He wanted peace with the Americans. Think about that for a moment. This was a man whose people had been fighting for their lives against scalp hunters for 40 years. A man who had grown up in a world where Mexican bounties made Apache children worth 25 pesos dead. And he was willing to try cooperation with these new arrivals who called themselves Americans. Cochise had good reasons for wanting peace. His band controlled Apache Pass, which meant they controlled the most practical route for American wagon trains crossing between New Mexico and California. Instead of fighting these travelers, Cochise saw an opportunity. His people could provide protection, supplies, even guides for Americans willing to pay fair prices and respect Apache territory. For a few years it actually worked. Cochise's band would escort wagon trains through Apache Pass, selling them food and water, protecting them from other Apache groups who might not be as interested in peaceful coexistence. American travelers wrote letters home, describing Cochise as dignified, intelligent, and remarkably trustworthy for what they called a savage. But there was always tension just beneath the surface. Because, while Cochise was trying to build a working relationship with American civilians, American military officers were getting different orders from their superiors. The Army's job was to make Apache territory safe for American expansion. Railroad routes needed to be surveyed. Telegraph lines needed to go up. Mining claims needed to be protected. Towns needed to be established. All of this required Apache cooperation or Apache defeat. And most Army officers figured defeat was more reliable than cooperation, which brings us back to Lieutenant George Bascom, and that February. Morning in 1861, a rancher named John Ward had reported that Apache raiders had stolen cattle and kidnapped his stepson, a boy named Felix Tellis. Ward demanded military action. So Lieutenant Bascom, with 54 soldiers and orders to recover the boy and punish the raiders, marched to Apache Pass to confront Cochise. Now here's where everything goes wrong. Bascom assumed that because Cochise was the most prominent Apache leader in the area, he must be responsible for every Apache action in the region. It's like assuming the mayor of Phoenix is personally responsible for every crime committed anywhere in Arizona. Apache bands operated independently. A raid by warriors from one group didn't mean other groups had anything to do with it. Cochise's band hadn't taken the ward boy. They probably didn't even know about the raid. But Bascom either didn't understand Apache society or didn't care. February 4th, Cochise arrived at the army camp with his brother, 2 nephews, a woman, and her child. He came under a flag of truce to discuss the situation. He told Bascom honestly that his people hadn't taken the boy, but he offered to help find out who had and negotiate for the boy's return. Bascom didn't believe him. Or maybe he just didn't care whether Cochise was telling the truth. What happened next changed everything. Bascom ordered his soldiers to arrest Cochise and his family as hostages until the ward boy was returned. Inside a tent that was supposed to represent American honor and military justice, soldiers grabbed a man who had come in peace to help solve a problem. But Cochise was Apache. He'd been fighting for survival his entire life. He pulled out a knife, slashed through the tent wall, and escaped in a hail of gunfire. His relatives weren't so lucky. Bascom held them as prisoners. Now think about what this meant to Cochise. He'd spent years building a relationship based on trust with American civilians. He'd risked his reputation among his own people to advocate for peace. He'd come voluntarily to help solve a problem he hadn't created. And American soldiers had repaid his cooperation by trying to kidnap him and his family. The message was clear. American promises meant nothing. American honor was worthless. The only language Americans understood was violence. Cochise's response was swift and devastating. Within hours, his warriors had captured 3 Americans at a nearby stage station. The next day, they took more prisoners from a wagon train. Cochise sent a message to Bascom: exchange prisoners. Release my family and I'll release your people. Bascom refused. He demanded the ward boy first. What followed was a negotiation conducted with hostages on both sides and growing anger that made compromise impossible. Cochise kept insisting his people didn't have the ward boy. Bascom kept insisting they did. Neither side trusted the other. Both sides had prisoners they couldn't release without losing face. February 6th, the situation exploded. Details of what exactly happened vary depending on who's telling the story, but the outcome was clear. Bascom's Apache prisoners were hanged. Cochise's American prisoners were tortured to death. The most peaceful Apache leader in the Southwest looked at the bodies of his brother and his nephews swinging from American ropes and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. If Americans wanted war, they would get war. But it would be war on Apache terms, in Apache country, against an enemy who understood every rock and canyon and water source better than the Americans ever could. The transformation of Cochise from peace advocate to implacable enemy was complete. And it came at the worst possible time for American expansion into Apache territory, because while Lieutenant Bascom was busy creating the most dangerous Apache enemy the United States would ever face, bigger events were reshaping American military priorities. The Civil War was starting. Most American troops were being pulled east to fight each other instead of fighting Apache. The few soldiers left in Apache territory were spread thin across impossible distances, trying to protect settlements and transportation routes with forces too small for the job. Cochise looked at this situation and saw opportunity. For the first time since Americans had arrived in Apache country, Apache warriors might actually outnumber American soldiers in some areas. For the first time, sustained campaigns against American targets might actually succeed in driving Americans out of Apache territory entirely, but Cochise also understood something that would make his war different from earlier Apache conflicts. The Americans weren't just another group of invaders looking for quick profit. They represented something much more dangerous, a civilization that could replace Apache culture completely if it wasn't stopped. American expansion wasn't just about controlling Apache territory. It was about transforming Apache territory into something unrecognizably different. railroads that would bring unlimited numbers of settlers, telegraph lines that would coordinate military responses faster than Apache intelligence networks could track them, towns that would claim the best water sources, mines that would destroy sacred sites, cattle ranches that would eliminate the plants Apache families depended on for survival. The Americans weren't just threatening Apache independence. They were threatening Apache existence. Cochise's war began in spring 1861 with attacks that demonstrated just how much the Americans had underestimated their new enemy. Stage stations were destroyed with a tactical precision that left investigators wondering how Apache warriors could coordinate such complex operations. Wagon trains disappeared so completely that rescue parties couldn't even find the wreckage. Mail routes that had operated safely for years suddenly became death traps, but the attack that really announced Cochise's intentions came at Apache Pass itself in July 1862. A force of California volunteers under Captain Thomas Roberts was escorting supply wagons through the pass when they found their route blocked by stone breastworks manned by Apache warriors. What followed was unlike anything American forces had experienced in Indian warfare. This wasn't a raid or a skirmish. This was a pitched battle between two armies, fighting for control of strategic terrain in temperatures that reached over 100 degrees. The Apache had chosen their ground carefully. They held the high positions overlooking the only practical route through the mountains. They had access to the springs that provided the only reliable water in the area. They had prepared defensive positions that would force any attacking force to advance uphill into concentrated fire. But the Americans had something the Apache had never faced before: artillery. Howitzers that could throw explosive shells into Apache positions from ranges where return fire with bows and captured rifles couldn't reach. For 6 hours, in heat that was killing men on both sides, Apache warriors with traditional weapons faced American soldiers with the most advanced military technology of their era. The sound of those howitzer shells exploding among the rocks could be heard for miles. The Apache had never experienced anything like it. But here's what gets me about this battle. The Apache didn't break. They didn't retreat in panic when the first shells started falling. They adapted. They learned. They figured out how to use the terrain to minimize the effectiveness of artillery fire. They turned a technological disadvantage into a tactical lesson. When the Americans finally fought their way through Apache Pass, they found something that should have terrified every military planner in the Southwest. The Apache hadn't just been defeated in battle. They'd been educated in battle. They now knew exactly what American artillery could and couldn't do. They knew how American infantry operated under combat conditions. They knew the limitations of American supply, systems and communication methods. Cochises, warriors melted away into the mountains with new knowledge that would make them infinitely more dangerous in future encounters. The Americans had won a tactical victory that had taught their enemies how to fight them more effectively. Captain Roberts wrote in his report, "The Apache showed a discipline and tactical sophistication that we did not expect to encounter in savage warfare. They are learning from every engagement and adapting their methods accordingly. This is not the enemy we were prepared to fight." By the end of 1862, Cochise controlled more territory than he had before the war started. American settlements had been abandoned. Supply routes had been cut. The Americans were learning what the Spanish and Mexicans had learned before them. Apache country belonged to the Apache, and everyone else was there only as long as Apache leaders decided to let them stay. But the Americans weren't Spanish conquistadors or Mexican scalp hunters. They were a nation with industrial resources, transcontinental railroads, and a military system that could move troops and supplies across vast distances faster than any force in history. The Civil War was ending. Thousands of battle-tested Union soldiers were about to be freed up for Indian fighting. New weapons, new tactics, and new levels of systematic organization were coming to Apache country. And the Americans were about to try something that no previous enemy had attempted. They weren't just going to fight Apache warriors. They were going to fight Apache culture itself. targeting the plants Apache families needed for food, the water sources that made Apache life possible, even the burial grounds where Apache ancestors rested. Cochise had turned American attempts at friendship into American determination to destroy everything Apache. The war he'd started to defend his people was about to become a war for Apache survival itself, and survival, as the Apache were about to learn, would require sacrifices that would test the limits of what any culture could endure and still remain itself. April 30th, 1871. 4:30 in the morning, Camp Grant, Arizona Territory. 144 Apache are sleeping in their wickiups near the Army post, under the protection of the United States military. These are Apache who have chosen peace. Apache who have agreed to live under American supervision in exchange for safety and regular food rations. Apache families who thought they'd found a way to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. In 2 hours, most of them will be dead. What happened at Camp Grant that morning represents something that should haunt every American who learns about it. Because this wasn't combat. This wasn't warriors dying in battle defending their homeland. This was the systematic slaughter of sleeping families by American citizens who had decided that the only good Apache was a dead Apache, and the way it happened tells you everything you need to know about how far the Apache Wars had pushed everyone involved beyond the boundaries of what civilized people call acceptable behavior. The attack was planned in Tucson by a committee of respectable citizens, businessmen, ranchers, politicians, the kind of people who went to church on Sunday and sent their children to school and thought of themselves as the pillars of their community. They'd grown tired of what they called the Apache problem, and they'd decided to solve it permanently. Their plan was simple. Apache families at Camp Grant felt safe because they were under Army protection. That sense of safety made them vulnerable. If you attacked at dawn, when people were sleeping deepest, if you moved fast and used overwhelming force, you could kill an entire Apache community before anyone could organize resistance. The Tucson Committee recruited Mexican civilians who had their own reasons to hate the Apache, Tohono O'odham warriors who had been traditional Apache enemies, and American settlers who saw Apache extermination as a patriotic duty. 148 men, armed with clubs, knives, and guns, riding through the night toward families who trusted American promises of protection. Now, here's what makes this story even more sickening. The Apache at Camp Grant weren't random refugees. They were people who had made the hardest choice imaginable. They'd given up their freedom to save their children's lives. For months, they'd been negotiating with Lieutenant Royal Whitman, the post commander at Camp Grant. Whitman was one of the few American officers who understood that the Apache Wars weren't going to end through military victory alone. There had to be some alternative to endless cycles of revenge killing. The Apache families who came to Camp Grant were exhausted. They'd been running for years, hiding in canyons, watching their children grow thin from hunger and fear. The women were tired of teaching their daughters to sleep so lightly that any sound would wake them. The men were tired of fighting battles they couldn't win against an enemy with unlimited resources, so they'd made a bargain. They'd give up their weapons. They'd accept American supervision. They'd live where American officials told them to live, eat what American officials gave them to eat, follow rules that American officials made for them. In exchange, their children would be safe. Lieutenant Whitman had promised them safety. The United States Army had guaranteed their protection. That promise lasted exactly 5 months. The attack began at sunrise. Sleeping families woke to the sound of gunfire and war cries, and the screams of people being clubbed to death outside their homes. Women tried to shield their children with their own bodies. Men tried to fight back with sticks and cooking implements because they'd surrendered their weapons as proof of peaceful intentions. It didn't matter. The attackers had planned for a slaughter, not a battle. They moved systematically through the Apache camp, killing everyone they could catch. When people tried to run, they were shot down. When people tried to hide, they were dragged out and beaten to death. Survivors described scenes that still make me sick to think about. Babies' heads crushed against rocks while their mothers watched. Pregnant women disemboweled. Old people too weak to run being hacked apart with machetes. Children who begged for mercy in Spanish they'd learned from Mexican captives, being killed anyway. 144 Apache died that morning. 8 of them were men. The rest were women, children, and old people. 29 children were taken captive to be sold as slaves in Mexico. Slaves. In 1871, 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, American citizens were selling Apache children into slavery and calling it justice. Lieutenant Whitman arrived at the scene hours later to find his post surrounded by bodies and blood and the ashes of wickiups that had been burned with families still inside them. He wrote in his official report, "I have seen the aftermath of many battles, but nothing could have prepared me for this. This was not war. This was the deliberate murder of people who had trusted us to protect them." Now think about what this meant to Apache families who were still hiding in the mountains, still trying to decide whether to fight or surrender. The message was unmistakable. American promises were worthless. American protection was a lie. The only choice was to fight until you died or watch your children be murdered while you slept. The Camp Grant massacre destroyed any possibility of negotiated peace for a generation. Apache leaders who had been considering surrender looked at the photographs that newspapers published of the dead families and decided they'd rather die fighting than die trusting. But the massacre also revealed something that military commanders were just beginning to understand about the changing nature of the Apache Wars. The real problem wasn't Apache warriors. Apache warriors you could fight. The real problem was Apache culture itself, the survival skills that let Apache families disappear into country where armies couldn't follow. General James Carleton, who commanded American forces in the Southwest, issued orders that make the government's intentions crystal clear. All Indian men are to be killed whenever and wherever found. The women and children may be taken prisoners, but of course they are not to be killed. But killing the men wasn't working. Apache women knew the same survival skills Apache men did. They could keep families alive in desert country just as well as warriors could. They could organize resistance, gather intelligence, maintain the cultural knowledge that made Apache independence possible. So American strategy evolved. If you couldn't defeat Apache culture by killing Apache warriors, maybe you could defeat it by destroying everything that made Apache life possible. The army began systematic campaigns against Apache food sources. Soldiers would spend weeks destroying century plants that Apache families depended on for winter food. They'd burn wickiups and clothing and tools. They'd poison waterholes. They'd kill horses and mules, not just to capture them, but to prevent Apache families from using them. The goal was to make Apache territory uninhabitable for Apache people. If you couldn't catch them, maybe you could starve them out. Apache women responded by developing survival techniques that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. They learned to hide children in caves so deep that crying couldn't be heard from the surface, while warriors led soldiers away in desperate decoy missions. They learned to live on foods that would have killed people from other cultures, certain roots that were barely nutritious, insects that could keep you alive when there was nothing else, even leather boiled until it became edible. But the most devastating change came in 1872, when General George Crook arrived in Arizona with a new strategy that cut to the heart of what made Apache resistance effective. Crook understood something his predecessors had missed. Apache success wasn't just about their skill as warriors or their knowledge of the country. It was about their unity as a people. Apache bands might fight independently, but they shared cultural knowledge, family connections, and survival techniques that made them collectively more dangerous than the sum of their parts. What if you could turn that strength into a weakness? What if you could turn Apache against Apache? Crook began recruiting Apache scouts. Not just a few individuals looking for revenge or profit, but entire groups of Apache who had decided that continued resistance was hopeless. Apache who knew every hiding place, every water source, every traditional camping ground that had sheltered Apache families for generations. Now think about what this meant to Apache families who were still trying to hide in the mountains. The soldiers chasing them weren't just Americans who might get lost or make mistakes. They were Apache. Apache who knew that the canyon you were hiding in had only one way out. Apache who knew that the water source you were heading for was 3 days away and you probably didn't have enough supplies to reach it. Apache who knew which plants your family would be looking for and where those plants grew. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you fight an enemy when you can't trust your own people? How do you maintain cultural unity when survival might depend on joining the people who are trying to destroy your culture? But even more devastating was what happened when these Apache scouts found Apache families. Because they weren't finding them to capture them or negotiate with them. They were finding them so American soldiers could kill them. Apache families who had survived decades of warfare against Spanish, Mexican and American enemies were being hunted down by people who spoke their language, knew their customs, understood their beliefs, and were helping foreigners destroy everything Apache culture represented. The success rate was terrifying. Crook's combined forces of American soldiers and Apache scouts could track down Apache families that had successfully hidden from purely American forces for months or years. They could predict where Apache leaders would go, what routes they would take, what mistakes they would make under pressure. By 1874, Apache families were facing choices that no human beings should have to make. They could keep running and watch their children starve in hiding places that were no longer secret. They could surrender and risk another campground massacre. Or they could fight battles they couldn't win against enemies who included their own relatives. Starvation became the deadliest enemy. Apache families that had once fed themselves comfortably off desert resources were reduced to eating horses, then mules, then leather, then anything that might keep children alive for one more day. Survivors described children whose ribs showed through their skin, elders who voluntarily stayed behind to die so the younger people could have their share of whatever food remained. And through it all, American military reports describe Apache resistance with a kind of frustrated respect that reveals just how much these campaigns were costing everyone involved. One officer wrote, "They fight like they have nothing left to lose," which I suppose is true. Every battle costs us more than we can afford, and they keep fighting anyway. But the Apache were losing more than battles. They were losing their culture piece by piece. Traditional ceremonies had to be abandoned because gathering enough people together made you a target. Children who should have been learning songs and stories were learning how to hide and how to run. Women who should have been teaching daughters the locations of food. Plants were teaching them how to survive on scraps. The hunting season had reached a level of systematic brutality that was destroying everything that made Apache life worth living. Families were being reduced to isolated fragments hiding in caves and canyon bottoms, afraid to light fires, afraid to make noise, afraid to trust anyone, including their own people. And the Americans were about to make it worse, because what came next would take Apache children away from their families entirely, shipping them off to schools where they'd be taught to forget everything their parents had tried to pass down to them. The attack on Apache culture was about to become total. And the question facing Apache families as 1875 arrived wasn't whether they could win their independence. The question was whether anything recognizably Apache would survive the hunting season at all. But here's what the Americans didn't understand about the people they were trying to destroy. Apache culture had survived 3 centuries of warfare by adapting to impossible circumstances. And even when adaptation meant surrendering freedom itself, even when it meant accepting captivity as the only alternative to extinction, Apache identity would find ways to survive. The trains that would carry Apache prisoners to Florida were already being prepared. The barracks that would hold Apache families for the next 27 years were already being built. The paradox that would define the end of the Apache Wars was about to reveal itself. Sometimes the only way to save your culture is to let your enemies capture your body. September 4th, 1886. Bowie Station, Arizona Territory. The last free Apache are boarding trains that will carry them 1,500 miles from the desert mountains they call home to the humid swamps of Florida. Men who once controlled territories larger than European kingdoms are now shackled prisoners being shipped east like cargo. But here's what's going to shock you about what happens next. Within months, many of these Apache prisoners will describe their new situation using a word that should make every American uncomfortable. Paradise. Now think about that for a moment. These are people who had lived their entire lives in freedom, people whose culture was built around independence and movement and intimate knowledge of vast territories. They're describing military prison as paradise. What does that tell you about what they'd been living through before they were captured? The train carrying Geronimo and the last Apache prisoners pulls away from Bowie Station, carrying 382 men, women, and children. Some are warriors who fought until the very end, but most are families who had surrendered years earlier and been living on reservations under Army supervision, trying to adapt to American ways. It didn't matter. When the Army decided to ship Apache prisoners to Florida, they took everyone. Warriors and farmers, fighters and peacemakers, adults and children. The message was clear. Being Apache was the crime, not any specific action any individual had taken. The journey east takes 8 days. 8 days of being stared at through train windows by curious crowds at every stop. 8 days of children asking why they're leaving the mountains. 8 days of elders wondering if they'll ever see home again. But when they arrive at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, something unexpected happens. For the first time in years, some of them for the first time in their lives, Apache families go to sleep without fear. Think about what that means. These people had been living under such constant threat that military prison felt safe by comparison. The testimonies Apache women gave to government officials in those first months of captivity revealed truths that should haunt us. One woman told investigators, "For 3 years, we could not sleep through the night. Every sound might be soldiers coming to kill us. Every day, we wondered if our children would live to see sunset." Here, the children sleep like babies. They do not wake up screaming from nightmares about bluecoats and gunfire. Another woman described the relief of regular meals. In the mountains, we ate when we could find food. Sometimes the children would cry from hunger, and we would have to move camp because crying might bring the soldiers. Here they bring us food every day. Our children's bellies are full. They are growing fat and happy. But the most heartbreaking testimony came from mothers describing what it meant to watch their children play without fear. At the reservation, we could never let the children run far from the Wickiups. Someone always had to watch for soldiers, for Apache scouts who might betray us, for settlers who might decide to kill Apache children for sport. Here behind these walls, my daughter laughs out loud. She runs and plays games. She's learning to be a child again, paradise. That's the word they used. Military prison had become paradise because the alternative, life as a hunted Apache in Apache territory, had become literally unendurable. But paradise in prison came with costs that would destroy Apache families in ways that warfare had never managed. Fort Marion was a Spanish colonial fortress built in the 1600s. Stone walls designed to withstand cannon fire surrounded cramped quarters that had never been intended to house hundreds of people for years at a time. The climate was everything Apache bodies weren't adapted for. Humid, swampy, breeding diseases that desert people had no immunity against. Within 6 months, Apache children were dying of illnesses their grandparents had never heard of. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, malaria, diseases that thrived in the Florida climate and killed people whose immune systems had been shaped by generations of life in dry mountain air. By the end of the first year, 1 in 10 Apache prisoners was dead. By the end of 3 years, 1 in 4 was dead. Paradise was killing them as surely as the hunting had, just more slowly and with better medical care. The army doctors were genuinely trying to help. They provided medical treatment that was advanced for its time. They made sure prisoners had adequate food and clean water and shelter. They documented the deaths carefully and tried to understand why people who seemed healthy were wasting away. But what they couldn't understand was that Apache people weren't just dying of disease. They were dying of separation from everything that gave their lives meaning. Geronimo's wife, Zye, provides the most tragic example. She'd survived decades of warfare. She'd hidden with her children in caves while soldiers hunted them. She'd gone hungry so her babies could eat. She'd endured every hardship that Apache resistance had demanded, but in the safety of Fort Marion, with regular meals and medical care and protection from enemies, Zye began to waste away. The doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with her. She just grew weaker and sadder and more distant until she died in her sleep. Dreaming, the other women said, of mountains she would never see again. Geronimo, the most feared warrior in Apache history, spent his days in prison, making bows and arrows to sell to tourists. 25 cents for a photograph with the famous Apache chief. 50 cents for a miniature bow made by the man who had held off the United States Army for years. The tourists wanted to see a savage. Geronimo gave them what they expected: war paint and fierce expressions, and stories of battles that grew more dramatic with each telling. But the other prisoners watched him count his quarters and knew what they were really seeing: a man who had once controlled his own destiny reduced to performing his own. Defeat for pocket change. The children suffered, differently, but just as profoundly. Apache culture depended on children learning hundreds of survival skills, cultural traditions, and spiritual practices from their elders. But prison life interrupted all of that. Worse, the government decided that Apache children needed to be civilized more quickly than their parents. 57 Apache children were separated from their families and sent to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, where they would be taught to forget everything their parents had tried to teach them. The Carlisle motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Apache children had their hair cut, their clothes burned, their names changed to American names. They were forbidden to speak Apache, forbidden to practice Apache customs, forbidden to maintain any connection to Apache identity. Parents at Fort Marion would spend months not knowing whether their children were alive or dead. Letters were rare and often arrived months late. Some families were never reunited. Children would die at Carlisle while their parents died in prison thousands of miles apart. But here's what's remarkable about this period. Even under these impossible circumstances, Apache culture found ways to survive. In the barracks at Fort Marion, grandmothers would whisper creation stories to children when the guards weren't listening. Women would teach traditional beadwork patterns, passing down clan identities in designs that looked like decoration to American observers, but carried deep cultural meaning to Apache. Men would gather in small groups to sing traditional songs so quietly that the sound barely carried beyond their circle. They'd share memories of specific places in Apache territory: this canyon where the eagle nested, that spring where the best medicinal plants grew, keeping the geography of home alive in conversation. The women developed their own forms of resistance. They'd save bits of traditional materials, certain kinds of thread, specific colors of beads, and create clothing that looked acceptable to prison officials but incorporated traditional Apache designs. They found ways to honor deceased relatives according to Apache custom, while making it look like they were simply mourning in the American way. Most importantly, they kept teaching children who they were. Not openly, that would have resulted in punishment or separation, but in quiet moments, in stories that sounded like fairy tales to American ears, in lullabies that carried the names of sacred places. Apache mothers made sure their children would remember something of what they'd lost. But the cost of cultural survival in prison was enormous. Traditional ceremonies that required large gatherings couldn't be performed. Seasonal rituals that connected Apache people to the natural cycles of their homeland became impossible. Young people who should have been learning adult responsibilities through participation In traditional activities instead learned to adapt to institutional routines. The ghost dance movement of 1890 offered false hope to Apache prisoners who were desperate for any sign that their situation might change. Native American prophets claimed that performing certain dances and songs would cause the white people to disappear and the old ways of life to return. Some Apache prisoners participated secretly, dancing in barracks late at night, whispering prayers that their ancestors would return to drive away their captors and restore them to their homeland. But the ghost dance was a movement born of desperation, not power. Instead of bringing liberation, it brought more restrictions when prison officials discovered what was happening. By 1894, 8 years into their imprisonment, Apache prisoners were writing letters to government officials that reveal the full tragedy of their situation. They were grateful for the safety and medical care and regular meals. They acknowledged that prison had probably saved their lives. But they were also dying inside from separation from everything that made life meaningful. One letter, written by several Apache leaders jointly, said, "We understand that you believe you have saved us from destruction. We understand that many of our people would have died if the hunting had continued. But we ask you to understand something as well. We are not animals that need only food and shelter to be content. We are people with connections to specific places, specific ceremonies, specific ways of life. In saving our bodies, you have wounded our souls." Geronimo spent his last years dictating his memoirs to government officials, trying to explain what the Apache Wars had meant to the people who fought them. But his stories were edited to fit American expectations of what an Indian autobiography should sound like. The complexity of Apache culture, the sophisticated reasons for Apache resistance, the profound connections between Apache people and Apache land, all of that was simplified into tales of savage warfare that confirmed what Americans wanted to believe about their conquest of the West. When Geronimo died in 1909, he was still technically a prisoner of war. He'd spent 23 years in captivity, selling photographs and performing his identity for audiences who saw him as a curiosity from America's frontier past. His last words, according to witnesses, were about the mountains of his childhood, which he'd never seen again after that train pulled. Away from Bowie Station, the 1913 release of the surviving Apache prisoners came too late for most of the families who had made the journey to Florida in 1886. Entire families lay buried in prison cemeteries scattered across the South. Children who had been born in captivity were being released to a homeland they'd never seen, carrying cultural knowledge that had been kept alive through 27 years of institutional suppression. Of the 382 Apache who had boarded trains in Arizona, only 261 were still alive to make the return journey. 121 people had died in the safety of military custody, victims of diseases, despair, and separation from everything that gave their lives meaning. But here's what the government officials who orchestrated this policy never understood. The testimonies of Apache women who called prison paradise weren't celebrating captivity. They were indicting a system that had made freedom so dangerous that losing it felt like relief. When being hunted becomes so brutal that capture feels like rescue, the hunters themselves have lost their humanity. When children sleep better in prison cells than in their ancestral homeland, something has gone fundamentally wrong with the relationship between peoples. The Apache prisoners who described Fort Marion as paradise were bearing witness to one of the darkest chapters in American history, the systematic destruction of a people's way of life carried out so thoroughly that survival itself required the surrender of everything that made survival meaningful. But they were also bearing witness to something else, the incredible resilience of human culture under impossible circumstances, even in military prisons, even separated from their homeland, even forbidden to practice their traditions openly. Apache people found ways to remain Apache. That strength would prove crucial in the years ahead, because the survivors returning to Arizona were about to face a homeland where sacred sites had become copper mines, where traditional camping grounds had become cattle ranches, where everything familiar had been transformed into something unrecognizably different. The paradise behind barbed wire had kept Apache bodies alive. Now they would have to discover whether Apache culture could survive in a homeland that was no longer home. 1893. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. 7 years into what would become the longest imprisonment of prisoners of war in American history. A baby is born in the prison barracks. She takes her first breath in captivity, opens her eyes to see stone walls instead of sacred mountains, hears English commands instead of Apache lullabies. She is Apache, but she has never seen Apache land. She is free according to the Constitution, but she is a prisoner according to Army regulations. By the time she is released, she will be 27 years old. She will have spent her entire life behind wire and walls, learning to be Apache from grandmothers who whisper stories in secret and mothers who teach traditional crafts when the guards aren't watching. Now multiply that story by dozens. Then think about what it means to keep a culture alive when the government has decided that culture shouldn't exist. The Apache prisoners had been moved twice since their arrival in Florida. First from Fort Marion to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, where the climate was even deadlier and more Apache families died of diseases their bodies couldn't fight. Then to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where Army officials hoped the drier climate would keep more prisoners alive long enough to complete their civilization. 27 years. That's longer than most people's careers. Longer than it takes to grow from birth to adulthood. Long enough for children to forget their homeland entirely and for elders to die without ever seeing home again. But here's what makes this period extraordinary in the history of cultural survival. The Apache didn't just endure 27 years of imprisonment. They used those 27 years to preserve and pass down cultural knowledge under circumstances that should have made cultural transmission impossible. The key was the women, always the women. Apache grandmothers became living libraries, carrying in their memories everything their people needed to remain Apache. Songs that could only be sung at certain seasons. Stories that explained the spiritual significance of places they couldn't visit. Medicinal knowledge that might save lives someday if they ever returned to country where those medicines grew. But teaching this knowledge required extraordinary caution. Army officials were constantly watching for signs of savage behavior that might need to be corrected. Apache ceremonies were forbidden. Apache languages were discouraged. Apache customs were seen as obstacles to the civilization process. So the grandmothers adapted. They would teach traditional beadwork patterns, claiming they were just decorating clothing for practical purposes. But every design carried meaning, clan identities, sacred symbols, geographical markers that kept the map of Apache territory alive in thread and beads. They would tell traditional stories, but frame them as entertainment for children rather than religious instruction. Creation myths became bedtime stories. Legends about sacred places became fairy tales. Spiritual teachings about the relationship between Apache people and Apache land became amusing anecdotes about talking animals and magical adventures. Army officials who overheard these sessions thought they were watching harmless old women entertaining children with primitive folklore. What they were actually witnessing was one of the most sophisticated cultural preservation projects in human history. The children born in prison faced challenges their parents couldn't fully prepare them for. They were growing up Apache in a world that constantly told them being Apache was wrong. They were learning traditional knowledge in fragments, stolen moments between institutional routines designed to make them forget who they were. But children are remarkably adaptable. The prison-born generation developed their own ways of maintaining Apache identity. They created games that incorporated traditional Apache skills, tracking, hunting techniques, plant knowledge, disguised as children's play. They invented codes that let them speak Apache concepts using English words when adults were listening. Most remarkably, they became bridges between the elder generation that remembered freedom and the institutional world that surrounded them. They could translate traditional Apache wisdom into forms that wouldn't trigger punishment from army officials. They learned to be Apache in secret, while appearing to be successfully civilized to their captors. The teenage years were the hardest. Apache adolescents in traditional culture would have undergone ceremonies that marked their transition to adulthood, learned specialized skills from same-gender adults, begun taking on responsibilities that connected them to the larger Apache community. Prison life offered none of that. Teenage boys had no warriors to learn from, no hunting grounds to test themselves in, no enemies to prove their courage against. Teenage girls had no traditional women's ceremonies to participate in, no seasonal gathering activities to master, no autonomous households to help manage. Instead, they had institutional routines, work details, English lessons, Christian services, all designed to replace Apache identity with American citizenship. But here's where the Cultural Preservation Project became truly remarkable. The imprisoned Apache developed parallel educational systems, official instruction that satisfied Army requirements, and unofficial instruction that maintained Apache knowledge. Young men would learn carpentry and farming during the day to demonstrate their progress toward civilization. But in the evenings, older men would teach them traditional Apache skills, how to read weather patterns, how to track animals, how to navigate by stars they couldn't see because of prison lights. Young women would attend classes in domestic skills, cooking American food, sewing American clothes, keeping house according to American standards. But their mothers and grandmothers would teach them Apache domestic skills, which plants could be used for medicine, how to preserve traditional foods, how to maintain Apache cultural practices within American-style households. The most dangerous knowledge to preserve was spiritual. Apache religious practices were specifically forbidden. Apache religious leaders were watched constantly for signs of heathen activity. Apache religious objects were confiscated and destroyed whenever they were discovered, but spiritual knowledge found ways to survive. Sacred songs were hummed as work songs. Religious symbols were incorporated into decorative beadwork. Spiritual concepts were embedded in stories that sounded like entertainment to casual listeners, but carried deep meaning to people who understood. The cultural context, the ghost dance movement of 1890 offered a moment when this hidden spiritual life almost broke into the open. Native American prophets claimed that performing certain rituals would bring back the dead, drive away white people, and restore traditional ways of life. For Apache prisoners desperate for any hope of liberation, the ghost dance represented everything they'd been praying for secretly. Some prisoners began participating in clandestine ceremonies, dancing in barracks after lights out, singing forbidden songs, believing that their ancestors would return to rescue them from captivity. But the ghost dance was a movement born of desperation, not genuine spiritual power. When army officials discovered Apache prisoners participating in ghost dance ceremonies, the result was more restrictions, more surveillance, more punishment for any display of traditional cultural practices. The failure of the ghost dance to bring liberation was devastating to Apache morale, but it also taught important lessons about cultural survival under oppression. Open resistance would only bring more oppression. The key to preserving Apache identity was to make it invisible to American observers, while keeping it completely visible to Apache eyes. Geronimo became the most famous example of this strategy. To American audiences, he was a reformed savage who had learned the benefits of civilization. He appeared at exhibitions and Wild West shows, sold photographs and handmade crafts, told stories about his warrior days that emphasized how much better his life had become since surrendering to American authority. But to Apache prisoners, Geronimo was something entirely different. He was a keeper of traditional knowledge, a living link to the time when Apache people controlled their own destiny. In private conversations with other prisoners, he would share memories of specific places in Apache territory, describe traditional hunting and warfare techniques, pass down cultural knowledge that might otherwise die with him. The tragedy was that Geronimo spent his final years performing his own defeat for audiences who saw him as entertainment. The great Apache leader, who had once held off the United States Army, was reduced to selling miniature bows and arrows for 50 cents apiece. His warrior reputation transformed into a commodity that helped fund his own imprisonment. When he died in 1909, still technically a prisoner of war, Geronimo's last words were reportedly about the mountains of his youth. He'd spent 23 years in captivity, dreaming about landscape he would never see again, carrying in his memory the geography of freedom that his younger fellow prisoners knew only through stories. But Geronimo's death also marked a generational transition that would prove crucial to Apache cultural survival. The prisoners who had known freedom were passing away. Leadership was shifting to people who had grown up in captivity but had learned traditional knowledge from the previous generation. These prison-raised leaders understood something their parents hadn't been able to fully grasp. Apache culture would have to change in order to survive. The traditional knowledge was precious and needed to be preserved, but it would have to be adapted to circumstances that previous generations had never imagined. By 1910, Apache prisoners were writing letters to government officials that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American politics and bureaucracy. They could argue their case in language that American officials understood, using legal and constitutional principles that Americans claimed to respect. But they were also maintaining cultural practices that connected them to centuries of Apache tradition. They were becoming bicultural, fully functional in American institutional settings while remaining authentically Apache in their private lives and family relationships. The children and grandchildren born in prison were the key to this cultural adaptation. They spoke English fluently, but also spoke Apache among themselves. They understood American bureaucracy, but also understood traditional Apache decision-making processes. They could work within American systems while maintaining Apache values. When the 1913 release finally came, it was these prison-born and prison-raised Apache who would have to figure out how to be Apache in a world that had never wanted them to exist at all. The statistics tell part of the story. Of the 382 Apache who had been imprisoned in 1886, only 261 were still alive to be released in 1913. 121 people had died in the safety of American custody, victims of diseases, despair, and separation from everything that made life meaningful. But the statistics don't tell the whole story. Because those 261 survivors carried with them cultural knowledge that had been refined and concentrated through 27 years of systematic attempts to destroy it. They were returning to Apache territory, with Apache identity not only intact, but in some ways stronger than it had been before imprisonment. The grandmothers, who had whispered stories in prison barracks, had created a generation of Apache who knew who they were even though they'd never seen their homeland. The cultural preservation project that had operated in secret for nearly 3 decades had worked, but the survivors were returning to a homeland that was no longer home. Sacred sites had become copper mines. Traditional camping areas had become cattle ranches. Water sources that had sustained Apache families for centuries were now owned by American settlers who had legal title to land that Apache people considered sacred. The question facing the released prisoners wasn't whether they had successfully preserved Apache culture through 27 years of captivity. The question was whether Apache culture could survive in an Apache homeland that had been transformed into something unrecognizably different. The ghosts they had been dancing for in exile were about to meet the ghosts that haunted the landscape they were returning to. And that encounter would test everything they had learned about cultural survival under impossible circumstances. 1913. After 27 years as prisoners of war, the surviving Apache are finally free to return to their homeland. But freedom, they're about to discover, is a word that means different things to different people. The Apache step off trains in Arizona to find a landscape that looks familiar but feels like a foreign country. The mountains are still there, the sacred peaks that had called to them through decades of captivity. But everything else has changed in ways that make their hearts sick. Where Apache families had once gathered century plants for seasonal ceremonies, copper mines now scar the mountainsides. Where traditional camping areas had provided shelter for generations, cattle ranches spread across valleys that had once echoed with Apache voices. Water sources that had sustained life for centuries now carry legal ownership papers in the names of people who had never seen. These places before the Apache were taken away. The survivors face a choice that no people should have to make. They can try to return to traditional ways of life on lands that are no longer theirs, or they can adapt to reservation systems designed to turn them into something other than Apache. Most choose adaptation, not because they want to, but because survival demands it. The reservation communities they join are poverty-stricken fragments of what Apache society had once been. Government policies have concentrated Apache families on the least valuable land in their former territory. The best agricultural areas, the most reliable water sources, the locations with the richest natural resources, all of that belongs to American settlers now. But here's what's remarkable about this period. The cultural knowledge that had been preserved through 27 years of imprisonment doesn't disappear. It goes underground, maintained by women who remember the old songs and elders who still know the locations of sacred places that are now private. And property. Apache grandmothers who had whispered stories in prison barracks continue whispering stories in reservation homes. But now they're teaching grandchildren who were born free, but who have never known what Apache freedom actually meant. Children who live in Apache territory, but who will grow up as American citizens, subject to American laws, educated in American schools. The boarding school era reaches its peak in the 1920s and 30s. Apache children are taken from their families and sent to institutions where they're taught to be ashamed of everything their parents had risked their lives to preserve. Hair is cut, clothes are burned, names are changed. Languages are forbidden. The Carlisle motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," becomes government policy across dozens of schools designed to eliminate Native American cultures by severing the connections between generations. But the Apache have learned something during their long imprisonment that serves them well during the boarding school years. They've learned how to maintain cultural identity in secret while appearing to conform to institutional demands. They've learned how to be Apache on the inside while performing American identity on the outside. Apache children at boarding schools develop the same survival strategies their parents had used in military prisons. They speak Apache to each other when teachers aren't listening. They maintain traditional relationships and clan connections through letters written in English, but carrying Apache cultural meanings. They learn American skills during the day and teach each other Apache knowledge at night. Most importantly, they come home for summers and vacations carrying American educations, but also carrying unbroken connections to Apache families and Apache communities. The boarding schools failed to achieve their goal of cultural elimination because Apache culture has learned to be resilient in ways the architects of those schools never imagined. The 1920s bring another challenge that tests Apache adaptability. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 declares all Native Americans to be American citizens, whether they want citizenship or not. Apache people who had fought wars to resist American authority are now Americans by law, subject to American taxes, eligible for American military service, bound by American legal systems. But citizenship also brings rights that previous generations of Apache hadn't possessed. The right to vote, the right to legal representation, the right to challenge government policies in American courts using American legal principles. Apache communities begin producing their own lawyers, their own political leaders, their own advocates who can work within American systems while fighting for Apache interests. They learn to use American legal tools to protect Apache cultural sites, Apache water rights, Apache treaty obligations that the government had ignored for decades. The transformation is gradual but profound. Apache people who had once resisted American authority through warfare begin resisting American authority through legislation, litigation, and political organization. They discover that American legal systems, properly used, can sometimes protect Apache interests better than Apache warfare had been able to do. World War II becomes a turning point that nobody could have predicted. The same government that had spent decades trying to eliminate Apache culture suddenly discovers that Apache language skills are valuable for military purposes. Apache code talkers use their primitive language to transmit messages that enemy forces can't decipher. The language that boarding schools had tried to beat out of Apache children becomes a crucial tool for American military victory. Apache warriors who had once fought against American expansion now fight for American survival against enemies who threaten the continent they both call home. The irony is profound and bitter. Apache men risked their lives for a country that had tried to destroy their culture, using cultural knowledge that American education policies had tried to eliminate, proving their patriotism to people who had questioned their right to exist. But the war also does something else. It shows Apache communities that they can be fully Apache and fully American at the same time. They don't have to choose between cultural identity and national loyalty. They can serve in American military forces while maintaining Apache values, speak Apache languages while fighting for American victory, honor Apache traditions while defending American interests. The returning veterans bring home more than military experience. They bring confidence, organizational skills, and connections to broader American society that help transform Apache communities in the post-war years. The civil rights movement of the 1960s finds Apache communities ready to fight for their rights, using lessons learned through decades of cultural survival and political adaptation. But Apache civil rights activism looks different from African American civil rights activism because the goals are different. African Americans were fighting for inclusion in American society. Apache people were fighting for the right to remain distinct from American society while participating in it on their own terms. They wanted cultural sovereignty, not just legal equality. Young Apache activists begin challenging everything their communities had accepted during the survival years. Why should Apache children have to choose between Apache knowledge and American education? Why should Apache families have to abandon traditional practices in order to participate in modern economic systems? Why should Apache communities have to become indistinguishable from American communities in order to prosper? The answer they discovered was that they didn't have to make those choices. American legal systems, properly understood and skillfully used, could protect cultural diversity rather than eliminate it. Treaty rights that had been ignored for decades could be enforced through courts that were finally willing to take Native American claims seriously. The cultural revolution that followed was led by young Apache, who had grown up bicultural, educated in American schools but raised in Apache homes, fluent in American legal and political systems, but still connected to traditional Apache knowledge and values. They began establishing tribally controlled schools where Apache children could learn Apache languages alongside English, Apache history alongside American history, Apache values alongside American skills. They began creating economic development programs that provided jobs and income without requiring Apache communities to abandon cultural practices. Most importantly, they began reclaiming sacred sites that had been taken during the years when Apache people lacked legal, standing to challenge government and private seizures of traditional lands, the struggle to protect Mount Graham from telescope construction becomes emblematic of modern Apache activism. This sacred mountain, where Apache people had conducted ceremonies for centuries, was being developed for astronomical research by the University of Arizona. Traditional Apache religious practices would be impossible on a mountain covered with scientific installations. The legal battle lasted for years and involved complex negotiations between Apache religious leaders, university officials, federal agencies, and international astronomical organizations. But the Apache prevailed, not through warfare, but through sophisticated use of American legal protections for religious freedom. That victory established a principle that has guided Apache communities ever since. Traditional Apache values and modern American systems don't have to be enemies. They can be allies when Apache people have the knowledge and skills to make them work together. Today's Apache nations represent the culmination of a cultural survival project that began in the first days of Spanish contact and continued through centuries of warfare, imprisonment, forced assimilation, and systematic attempts at cultural elimination. Apache children grow up learning traditional languages that were nearly lost but have been revitalized through community education programs. They learn traditional skills that had been practiced in secret for decades but are now taught openly in tribally controlled schools. They learn traditional values that had been preserved by grandmothers whispering stories in prison barracks and reservation homes. But they also grow up fully equipped to succeed in modern American society. They attend colleges and universities, work in professional careers, participate in national political processes, contribute to American economic and cultural life while remaining authentically Apache, the casinos and resorts that provide economic foundations for modern Apache communities aren't betrayals of traditional values. They're applications of traditional values, using available resources to ensure community survival and prosperity, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining core cultural principles, providing for future generations by working within systems that exist rather than systems you wish existed. Apache women who run tribal businesses carry forward the same economic leadership roles that Apache women had played during the warfare years. Apache men who serve in tribal governments carry forward the same community service traditions that Apache warriors had embodied during the resistance period. The continuities are as important as the changes. Apache culture today looks different from Apache culture in 1840, but the core values that made Apache survival possible, adaptability, community solidarity, reverence for the land, careful stewardship of cultural knowledge, willingness to make necessary sacrifices for future generations, those values remain intact. The testimonies of Apache women who called military prison paradise after years of being hunted speak across generations to remind us that when captivity becomes refuge, freedom itself has been corrupted. But those same testimonies also remind us that cultures can survive even systematic attempts at destruction when people are willing to preserve what matters, most even under the most impossible circumstances. Modern Apache communities stand as living proof that the hunting season that began in 1540 and continued through 1913 didn't achieve its ultimate goal. Apache people weren't eliminated. Apache culture wasn't destroyed. Apache connections to Apache lands weren't permanently severed. The mountains that witnessed 3 centuries of warfare now witness something else. Apache families raising Apache children who know their history, speak their languages, practice their traditions, and participate fully in the larger American society that once tried to make them disappear. The eagles that soar over those sacred peaks see Apache people who carry forward the legacy of survivors, people who learned that sometimes the only way to save your culture is to let your enemies think. They've captured your body while keeping your spirit free. The ashes of the Apache Wars gave birth to something the architects of those wars never imagined. Apache nations that are stronger, more unified, and more politically sophisticated than Apache society had ever been during the centuries of independence, from the blood on sacred mountains to the paradise behind barbed wire to the eagles rising from reservation lands. The Apache story teaches us that cultural survival is possible under any circumstances if people are willing to pay the price that survival demands. And that price, as the Apache learned through 3 centuries of resistance and adaptation, isn't the abandonment of who you are. It's the determination to remain who you are, no matter what the world tries to make you become.